Hello there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining me today for Stay Free with Russell Brand. I've got Colonel Douglas Macgregor on the show. This is a significant and powerful conversation that I'm so excited to convey to you. We're talking to what I would call a proper military expert, a general. This is a person who understands the ins and outs of battle. There's moments in this conversation where you can see he's just burbling, bristling, bridling with desire to talk about military strategy, exactly how these things work, about how the ingenuity of war has been lost in and replaced with a kind of mindless system of execution, that there is no strategy, that there is no glory, that the American military is being hollowed out from within in the service of the military-industrial complex and globalists, that to be a patriot now is almost to be a revolutionary. And we all remember how America began. This is going to make any of you that are interested in true change very, very excited indeed, because I got the sense that we could be reaching the point where, like, the military might side with the people against the government. What could be more exciting? What could be more exciting than that? We'll be on YouTube for the first 15 minutes. You'll get to see a little bit of this conversation, but to see it in its entirety, and I recommend that you do, you'll have to join us over in that sweet stream of freedom that we call home. Now, many of you will have seen Colonel Douglas Macgregor before when he's been on Tucker, but I love this conversation. We get deep real fast. So become an awakened wonder. Use the code I surrender, and you can join us when these conversations happen live. But not just that, we do exclusive videos. This week we've got a brilliant one on fluoride in the water that you'll just love. I can't get into it because I'm so excited to get to Colonel Douglas Macgregor, but we'll give you a month free if you use the code I surrender. And also, while we're on the subject, why don't you get yourself one of these farting crow mugs, 25% off this week, and every penny of it that we get, we use to support people with addiction issues. Now, Colonel Douglas Macgregor is a US Army colonel. He's a retired combat veteran and CEO of OurCountry, OurChoice.com. And I'll be joining him on his show soon. And it's a brilliant conversation. You will really love it. We spoke about Ukraine, Taiwan, Israel, how American vets feel. So if you want to see these conversations live when they happen, become an awakened wonder. But here it is now in its glorious entirety. You're going to love it. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on Stay Free today.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
One of the things I noticed in your country on a recent visit is when I was speaking to a lieutenant colonel who's obviously a West Point graduate, and several other members of military families, I sensed a great deal of discontent and dissatisfaction from, in this case, servicemen that were deeply patriotic, as you might imagine, obviously, and yet have serious questions about the American government's activities, in particular, obviously, their military activities. What does it tell us about the state of a nation when those that we would assume to be most patriotic are at odds with the leadership of their nation?
Well, remember that soldiers normally, so we'll say for discussion purposes, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, but I normally think in terms of soldiers, they're men of action, and men of action have, as Goethe says, very little conscience. In other words, they're people who are prepared to act quickly and decisively, on the orders of their government. And I think that that's been true for most of our history. The problem at this point is that I think we've reached a turning point where people are actively questioning what the hell are we doing here? I mean, the average soldier gets off a plane in a place like Iraq. He spends about 15 minutes there. He looks around and he says, "There's nothing here. Why am I here?" And very shortly thereafter, he concludes, "There's nothing here worth my life. So I'm going to make damn sure that I come home because I don't want to die in this godforsaken place." That's not a good thing. You cannot maintain an effective military establishment with that attitude. But I think that's what most soldiers finally conclude in places like Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq. We're not social workers. We're not crusaders. And remember, our mission is to uphold and defend the Constitution, obey the orders of the president. What's that got to do with social engineering in Iraq or feeding starving people in Somalia? Not a great deal. I mean, we could do those things, but that's not what we exist to do. So I think you're dealing with people who are questioning the very rationale for what they do in the military.
Once the phrase support the troops, Colonel, was an easy way to silence dissent. Now it seems to support the troops would mean to oppose the agenda of the American establishment and, if I might offer, the military-industrial complex. So what does that suggest has altered in the last 30 years? And I suppose intuitively I might imagine, based on your answer and your citation of Iraq, although I'm sure much of that is based on personal experience, did something change around the time of that conflict, or is this something that's been happening since the end of World War II? When did the idea that supporting the troops meant patriotism and shut your mouth and get behind the agenda, when did that idea start to disintegrate?
Well, I think we've been through this transformation or evolution, whatever you want to call it, twice. We certainly went through this in the 1960s with Vietnam. And I remember the violent arguments in my own home between my mother's generation and my grandparents' generation. And she would say repeatedly, I don't like Lyndon Johnson, the president, but we have to support the troops. And my grandfather, who had been in the First World War, said, well, if you want to support the troops, get them the hell out of there and bring them home. But of course, he thought World War I was a complete waste of time and had been a terrible mistake. So I think we've been through this several times. The difference now is that it's not just a question of what we're doing overseas, it's a question of what we're doing at home. Americans are coming back and saying, well, what's happened to my country? I went overseas ostensibly to defend the interests of the United States, and no one here is willing to enforce the law. Our borders are open. You know, every conceivable form of perversion seems to be tolerated, and anyone who objects is branded as a criminal. So, you know, this is the ultimate expression of everything, I think, that is concerning in the United States today. Soldiers are no different than anybody else. They're probably more patriotic, as you point out, but they're saying, what are we doing to ourselves? What are we doing overseas? This is all insanity.
Has then an evident fissure emerged, not only as has been observable and palpable for a long time, between the interests of the establishment and the interests of what you might call ordinary Americans, but a fissure has emerged between the interests of the American establishment and the American military, which you've just indicated is something that's almost rhythmic, that it's happened before. After the First World War, there was cynicism about subsequent wars. And I wonder now if, in this age of information and instantaneous communication, with the ability for dissent to be so widely spread and proliferated, if it's impossible to sustain the kind of dominion that was plausible before. I mean, many of the pieces that have impacted me involve, American serviceman Aaron Bushnell setting himself on fire. I've seen active service personnel talking about mandated programs within the military, medical programs that were mandated, that were unpopular, I understand, with many service people. So now people are aware, because I suppose in your earlier example, somehow the dissent that arose from dissatisfaction in the First World War was able to be quashed and compliance was able to once again be achieved for subsequent conflicts. Now it seems to me that that dissent might reach a kind of tipping point. Do you agree? Is that possible, Colonel?
No, I think we're reaching more than just a tipping point. I think we've sort of walked off the cliff and are headed into an abyss right now at high speed. And I think lots of people in uniform sense this. But keep in mind that the senior ranks are highly politicized. In other words, the ruling class in Washington, and you can call it whatever you like, this globalist neocon class, whatever you care to call it, is effectively owned by donors. So we talk about donor occupation of Washington. In other words, Washington used to be a place where we said corporate interests occupied it. Today, it's donor occupied. We have our own version of oligarchs with billions and billions of dollars. They are capable of buying up members of Congress and have effectively done so. You know, on one of your previous shows, you had a gentleman on and you pointed out that only 21 people had voted against this latest legislation, sending billions of dollars overseas and at the same time disenfranchising us from the Bill of Rights, essentially saying that you can conduct surveillance without a warrant. Well, how could these things happen? Well, it happens because there's no incentive for the people on the Hill in Washington, D.C., in the Capitol, to respond to their constituents, to respond to the average American. They're responding to their donors. There's a saying in Washington, voters don't get you elected, donors get you elected. In other words, why bother with the so-called citizenry? It's the donor who makes or breaks you. And they spend all of their time collecting money from donors in order to stay in office. So they have to vote in a certain way. I mean, it's kind of the ultimate corruption that Cromwell confronted when he tossed out the rump parliament. First he tossed out the parliament, then the rump parliament, and ended up dictating to the country. Well, I think we've reached a similar condition in the United States. And it's just that people are looking around at the wars that we've been involved with. They're not wars on the scale of the Second World War, certainly, but military interventions. And they've concluded, hey, what do we get from this? Where's the return on investment? And then, of course, they've seen very recently with Mr. Trump, who's been saying this for years, who did a 180-degree turn and supported this latest legislation, which fuels the stupidity overseas in Ukraine, fuels the operations in the Middle East, fuels Taiwan, this conflict with Taiwan and China that is entirely of our making at this stage, has nothing to do with reality.
Now, we have to start this conversation before you hear Colonel Macgregor's answer. Click the link in the description if you're on YouTube. We're just going to be here for about another 10 seconds. I want to tell you that the conversation gets deep and you will love it. Consider becoming an Awaken Wonder. Remember, you just have to use the code ISurrender. You get 1 month free. There's so much to it. You'll be part of the movement. You'll love it. See you in a few seconds. Click the link.